Hi, YouTube. So, I figured since Lorne has only read the first two chapters of his book for YouTube, that I would pick up and read the rest of it so that it's out there. There's been other Lornographers who have read it out, but I figured I'd put my hand in. Taken Abroad, Chapter 3, by Lorne Armstrong. Aaron looked down at his watch as he stood beside his fellow soldiers, dressed in his BDUs with his backpack securely fastened around him. 4:30 a.m. Iraq time. This was it, he thought to himself. This is the moment I've waited so long for and trained so hard for. He could feel his anxiety grow when he fell in behind his fellow soldiers to step aboard the plane that was to carry his unit of 51 soldiers into Iraq. His unit leader, Staff Sergeant Buchanan, was the last man to step aboard the plane before they closed the door and headed for the runway. Aaron closed his eyes when he felt the airplane picking up speed. He could feel the bumps from the runway easily through the soles of his combat boots on the bottom of his feet. Mind you, soles is spelled wrong. Then he felt his body move at the uneven angle as the nose of the plane began to lift off the ground and speed into the air. He said a silent prayer for himself, his family, and his fellow soldiers. He opened his eyes to find his unit leader, Sergeant Buchanan, looking at him. He gave him a smile as his leader gave him a thumbs up for reassurance. He fidgeted with the excess strap from his backpack belt while a million things ran through his mind. The flight to Iraq seemed to take forever. He wasn't sure he was prepared for what he was going to see when he got off the plane, but knew there was nothing he could do about it now. Aaron felt his stomach suddenly turn very warm when he felt the plane begin to descend. In just moments, he would be landing in the country that would change his life forever. He felt the jolt of the plane as the tires touched the ground. His limbs went numb, and his stomach felt as if the food would come up at any time. He swallowed hard and beat the rising gorge back down into his stomach as the plane began to slow to a crawl. As he pulled the release handle on his seatbelt, he repositioned himself to stretch and prepared to disembark from the plane. He had expected to hear a lot of noise and see explosions in the distance when he got his first glimpse of Iraq, but was happy to find it quiet in the dark, early morning hours. He hadn't planned on it raining like it was, but he would be outside only long enough to go from the plane to the hangar anyway. The unit had all entered the hangar and sat on the floor as directed by Sergeant Buchanan after removing their backpacks. Aaron felt the concrete floor getting more and more uncomfortable after sitting through 2 hours of what the next 3 days' agenda would be. After the 2-hour lecture, the unit gathered up their backpacks and made their way to their bunks. Aaron located his bunk and began unpacking his gear. He had his gear all spread out over the bottom bunk when he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around to find his friend, Sergeant Paula Pabla, there with a smile on his face and his index finger pointing to the top bunk, indicating to Aaron that the bottom bunk was his. "Oh, no way," Aaron said with a smile spreading across his face. "Oh, yes way," Paul replied, grinning back at him. "Rank has its privileges, you know," he said as he smiled and patted Aaron on the back. "Well, I guess I can be thankful for a good bunkmate anyway," Aaron stated. Once he gathered up his things from the bottom bunk and placed them on the top bunk, he realized he wasn't at all upset about sharing the bunk with Paul. In fact, he was quite happy about it. He just couldn't believe that out of all the guys in the unit he could have gotten forced to share a bunk with, he was lucky enough to get one of his good friends. Over the next 3 days, Aaron and Paul spent their time getting to know the base and the areas that surrounded it. They distributed ammunition throughout the base and took the necessary classes they needed for out in the field. The 4th day, Aaron and Paul and a couple of other guys they worked with drove a Humvee, spelled H-U-M space the letter V, into the city to get to know the area there. Aaron drove especially slow because he was also looking around at all the new sites. They were pointing out places that had been bombed and gunfights had taken place between the American soldiers and the insurgents. They noticed that this particular area of the city was almost deserted because of all the damage that had been done to the buildings. There were people still there, but not many that hung about in the streets. Aaron quickly slammed on the brakes when a man ran out in front of the Humvee and stood there blocking its path. He couldn't figure out why the man would want to run out in front of a moving vehicle, especially one as large as a Humvee. Aaron sat there and looked at the man for what felt like 20 minutes, but in reality was nothing but mere seconds. The man had short black hair with a long beard, an athletic build, and was about 5 feet 9 inches tall, wearing torn brown pants and a white long-sleeve shirt. Aaron looked over at Paul, and they suddenly realized that this guy was a suicide bomber. All 4 men in the Humvee ducked down just in time as the man in the road blew himself into pieces. After the explosion, all 4 men sat up and looked at each other with a sigh of relief that they were all still alive. "I can't believe that just happened," Aaron said. "We better call in the base and let them know what happened," Paul stated. "We'll have to cordon off the area until the police get the mess cleaned up." They called into the base to inform them of the suicide bomber, and then it killed no one else but the bomber himself. Then they got out of the Humvee to rope off the area. When Aaron stepped out, he grew pale at the sight of human flesh that had been stuck to the vehicle and building walls around him. As he took his first step after closing the door to the Humvee, he felt an odd feeling under his left boot that felt like he had stepped on a thin carpet. He lifted his boot to find a piece of human scalp stuck to the bottom of his boot. That did it for him. "Oh God!" he exclaimed as he pulled the scalp from his boot, turned, and lost his breakfast in the middle of the street. Paul ran to his side. "Are you alright, Aaron?" "Yeah," he answered. "There's just some things that even the army can't prepare a person for, I guess." "That was one thing that none of us were prepared for," Paul answered. "Let's get this area roped off before anyone else steps into a mess." The next couple of nights, Aaron found it hard to sleep and hard to concentrate on his work during the day. He and Paul had both stayed up talking about the incident of the suicide bomber on the 3rd night. It seemed to help them both face what had happened, and they both were able to sleep better. From that time on, whenever they found something that was bothering them enough so they couldn't sleep or couldn't concentrate on their work, they would talk to each other, so they could get it out of their system and not have to keep it bottled up inside. Over the next month, Aaron and Paul attended many training classes on how to react to IEDs, improvised explosive devices, how to close off specific areas after bombings and raids, how to raid houses, and how to train Iraqi police. He kept busy, so there wasn't much time for a lot of recreation. In his off time, Aaron would either get on the computer and talk to his mother, or call her on the phone. Sounds like Lorne. If he and Sergeant Pablo had time, they would get in a game of basketball or a couple video games. During the first month, there was a couple of rounds of mortar that hit the base that Aaron and Paul had to clean up. He was never bored, but always wished he could be in a little bit more of the action. "Do you think we'll ever see any more of the action than what we're seeing here, Paul?" Aaron asked. "Yes, I do," Paul replied. "And from what I've been hearing, it's not going to be too long before we do." Aaron gave Paul a stunned but enthusiastic look after his comment. "What have you heard?" he asked as he leaned in closer to make sure he didn't miss a word of what Paul was going to tell him. "Well, from what Sergeant Buchanan was telling me, the Marines are pushing a group of insurgents toward the outskirts of Mosul, and we have to help corner them. We'll be going right in the middle of the action to repair any vehicles that break down and are expected to fight if necessary, so we'll have to go in with our weapons ready to fire." "When is this all supposed to happen?" Aaron asked with anxiousness. "Within the week," Paul replied with a slight grin, knowing how much Aaron has wanted to be in with the fighting. It's a fucked up sentence. "Have they made up teams yet?" Aaron asked, pushing to learn more of the situation. "Yes. You and me are on a team with Private Baker and Private Gentry," Paul answered. "Do Baker and Gentry know about this yet?" "No. I just found out about it this morning. I was supposed to wait until this evening to inform you all of it at the same time, so if anyone asks, you don't know anything about it yet." Aaron looked at his friend and smirked. "All right." The rest of the day, he did his best to keep his mind on his work, although it wasn't easy. That night, he lay in his bunk thinking about being in the middle of the action. It took him a couple of hours to get to sleep. Over the next few days, his excitement grew more and more as he waited anxiously for word that the Marines had pushed the insurgents to the point where the army was now needed to help corner them. Paul could see Aaron's anxiety as he approached him. He'd been seeing it over the last few days. "I know you've been anxious," for word for us to go out into the action, Aaron. I just wish I could share your enthusiasm." Paul watched Aaron's shoulders fall because Aaron was hoping he was coming with word about the insurgents. Paul hesitated as he saw Aaron sigh, then watched a smile appear on Aaron's face when he blurted out, "We have to be packed and ready to leave in 1 hour. We're also changing our position, too." Aaron gave Paul a dumbfounded look as he asked, "What do you mean changing our positions?" "We're not going in to work on vehicles. We're going in to fight," Paul explained. "What made them change our position?" Aaron asked. "The insurgents kidnapped a taxi driver and are threatening to kill him if their demands are not met." Paul shifted gears in his voice and tried to hide his nervousness. "Let's get this stuff ready. I still have to inform Baker and Gentry." Aaron began loading ammunition into the Humvee, while Paul fetched Baker and Gentry. When they returned, the 4 of them had the vehicle loaded and ready to move out in about 40 minutes. "Okay, men, who wants to drive?" Paul asked. Aaron stepped forward. "I'll drive." "Okay, let's go then." They all piled into the vehicle, Aaron in the driver's seat and Paul riding shotgun, with Gentry and Baker in the back. "We have to go to the police station first to let the Iraqi police know that we're here to help them," Paul explained. Aaron pulled into the parking lot of the police station and parked near the entrance door. He turned the engine off and noted the shabby look the building held. All 4 of the men got out and walked toward the building. Upon entering it, they had to stand still for a moment to let their eyes adjust to the dimly lit room. They found the translator standing next to the clerk's desk. The man held out his hand to greet the soldiers. "Hi, I'm Staff Sergeant Pablo. I need to let the police know that we're here to help them." The translator was an American, Paul could tell. He felt relieved that it would be easy to communicate with police with the translator present. "My name is Staff Sergeant Randolph. Hold on right here and I'll let the police chief know." Paul and Aaron stood watching the sergeant as he left the room and made his way down the narrow hall. Before he could return, they heard gunfire coming from nearby. Paul, Aaron, Baker, and Gentry rushed outside. They reached the Humvee just in time to dodge a bullet that ricocheted off the police station. They couldn't fire back until they found out which direction the shots were coming from. Then another bullet hit the police station, closer to the Humvee this time. "Are they trying to hit the Humvee?" Aaron asked himself. His question was answered as the next bullet twanged off the back of the Humvee. "They're shooting from between those 2 buildings over there," Paul shouted as he pointed to the building across the street. "Aaron, go behind that concrete barrier on the right side of the police station and shoot. Baker, you go to that concrete barrier on the left side of the police station and shoot. Me and Gentry will stay here and shoot from both sides of the Humvee," Paul ordered. Aaron and Baker both ran to their designated positions and began to fire back at the insurgents. Paul and Gentry began firing back also from the sides of the Humvee. The insurgents must have been overwhelmed by the firepower the 4 men held because the shooting ceased after only 5 minutes. Once Paul felt all was safe enough, they went back into the police station and were updated that the kidnapped taxi driver had been killed and that they needed to find the man's body. After a few minutes' deliberation, the 4 men headed back out to the Humvee and climbed in. They drove around the block to make sure the insurgents were gone. Then they cordoned off the area and began a search for the taxi driver's body. Aaron and Paul walked toward the 2 buildings to begin searching, while Baker and Gentry began walking in the opposite direction to start searching. "Keep your eyes sharp," Paul said to Aaron. "You never know if or where an insurgent could be hiding." Aaron could feel his adrenaline picking up as he inched toward the back of the building where the insurgents had been shooting from. He inched his head from the corner to take a cautious look. Paul's notion that the insurgents had left was right on the money. Aaron found as he looked down at the body laying motionless on the ground behind the building. Aaron and Paul walked up to the man with caution, checking for any bombs that the insurgents may have left behind as a booby trap. To their relief, there was none. They looked down at the lifeless body of the taxi driver. "Not an old man," Aaron said to Paul. "Late 20s or early 30s, maybe." Then Aaron looked down at the hands tied between the man's back and his ankles tied crisscrossed. He moved his eyes back to the man's face that lay with one cheek flat against the dirt and saw the bullet hole between the man's eyes, just above his brows. The man had been killed execution style. A tear appeared from Aaron's eye and his face grew pale. He felt a great pain for that man that had been carelessly murdered. Paul put his hand on Aaron's shoulder. "Let's call it in that we found the man's body so they can give him a proper burial as soon as possible." Aaron wiped the tear from his eye and then turned with Paul to radio Baker and Gentry that they had found the body and to meet them back at the police station. After letting the police know they located the body, Aaron, Paul, Baker, and Gentry piled back into the Humvee and headed back to the base. Paul and Aaron held quiet up front as Baker and Gentry drew a short, chopped-up conversation between the two of them on the ride back. Both Paul and Aaron knew that they should probably spend a couple hours talking to each other about their feelings and what they had seen and been through that day, but neither could find the words to begin talking about it, so they both just lay silently, staring into the dark. It was about 1 a.m. when Aaron had finally drifted off to sleep. He was having trouble all night as he tossed and turned and finally woke up around 4 a.m. in a cold sweat from the nightmare he had been having. He had laid there, deep in thought and motionless as a tear rolled down his cheek. It took another hour before he fell back asleep. It was 8 a.m. when he finally woke up. He was late for work, but Paul had left a note on his bed explaining to him he knew he had a hard time sleeping, that he didn't wake him up for work because he knew he needed the rest. You tossed and turned all last night. Get showered and dressed and come into work when you wake up, the note read. Aaron pushed the thoughts of the previous day's events out of his head the best that he could and climbed off his bunk. He gathered up his things and moved to the shower to wash the night of sleep away and thoughtlessly slid into his uniform. He tossed his cap on his head and walked out the door and walked to the mess hall to get some assistance from a cup of coffee and a biscuit for some energy. Who wants a biscuit? The next week and a half was all repetition. Go to work, then bed. All the while, Aaron still had thoughts of the taxi driver. The images of his lifeless body laying there in front of him haunted Aaron every night in his dreams. He had called home and talked to his mom and let her know some of the events that had taken place and to reassure her that he was alright, even though he tried to disguise the tone in his voice so that his mom couldn't see how much he was bothered by the things he had seen. He still got the feeling that she could tell he had changed from the last time she had talked to him. Aaron hung up the phone, feeling better after talking to his mama. Somehow hearing her voice had restored a comforting feeling that was lost at the sight of the dead taxi driver. 3 weeks had gone by since the shootout with the insurgents at the police station. Paul walked over to Aaron with a look on his face that told Aaron something was up. Where do we have to go? Aaron asked Paul before Paul even got a word out. We have to go to the Iraqi police station again, Paul replied. What's going on this time? He asked. Nothing. We're going to be training them. Paul looked at Aaron and noted the sigh of relief and also a hint of regret on his face. They left and gathered up Baker, Gentry, and Jerry Bowler, a worker from the refueling unit, because they needed an extra man, and left in the Humvee for the Iraqi police station. As they approached the police station, Aaron looked at the building to his left where he had found the taxi driver. Will I ever get that image out of my mind? He asked himself. He was able to move the thought from his head for most of the day as they were training the Iraqi police. After 10 hours of training, Aaron was ready to go back to the base and lay his head on the pillow for a long night of rest. On the way back to the base, the guys were laughing and discussing the day's events of training the Iraqi policemen. The ride was quiet and smooth, and Aaron slouched easily back against his seat while Paul drove along. He closed his eyes and took in the conversation and put his remarks in when he needed to. He could feel himself begin to fall asleep, so he quickly sat up and rubbed his eyes back into focus and looked at the road ahead. Just as his eyes got focused, an explosion threw the Humvee sideways and Paul slammed on the brakes as he was now placed in the opposite lane. Is everyone alright? Paul asked. He looked at Aaron to his right, saw that he was fine, and turned around to check on Baker, Gentry, and Bowler. Jerry had his hand over his ears and was slightly bent over his seat. Jerry, are you alright? Paul asked. Jerry? He repeated. Jerry still didn't reply. Aaron turned around and grabbed Jerry's hands to pull them away from his ears. As he lifted his left hand from Jerry's ear, he saw a small stream of blood roll down Jerry's earlobe from inside his ear. We need to get him to a hospital now, Aaron said to Paul. Paul took his foot off the brake and stepped down heavily on the accelerator. I think we should all get checked out while we're there, he stated. Aaron looked at the confused look on Jerry's face. He could tell that Jerry couldn't hear anything, but admired the way he remained calm. At the hospital, everyone checked out all right except Jerry. The doctor informed Paul, Aaron, Baker, and Gentry that Jerry's eardrum had been blown out from the explosion and that he would have to remain at the hospital. They all went to their bunks and prayed that night for Jerry to recover and thanked God that nobody got killed in the explosion. The next few months went by quickly, and Aaron thought less and less about the incident with the taxi driver. Although it still remained in his mind, he was able to deal with it easier than he had when it first happened. He had a hard time when he had to say goodbye to Jerry. Although he still had his life, thank God, he he would never be able to hear again because of the explosion that took his eardrums. Aaron spent most of his time with Paul even when they weren't working and training the Iraqi police. They grew very close, and Aaron was happy he had someone he could confide in when he was having a hard time. He couldn't imagine how much harder this time in Iraq would have been if he hadn't had Paul there with him. Aaron would call his mother about once every 2 weeks, along with write her letters to let her know that he was alright, and to update her on everything that was going on. He let her know that even though he was proud of the things they were doing to help the Iraqi people, he had a hard time dealing with some of the things that he'd seen happen and been through. Things aren't at all what I'd pictured in my head when I joined up Mom, he said. Most of the time, his thoughts would drift back to the suicide bomber and the taxi driver. There had been much more since then, but for some uncertain reason, he would still think back to those 2 incidents. Maybe it was because they were the first things of this nature he'd ever witnessed in his innocent life. His mom let him know that she could tell he had changed just by talking to him on the phone. "How can you tell just by talking to me on the phone?" he asked. "I'm your mother. It's my job to know these things." As much as he tried to hide his feelings, she still knew. He was always amazed at the insight his mother had into his life. Paul would always tell Aaron, if it weren't for mothers, the world would be a hard place to live in. So insightful.